Hello, and welcome to week 30 of our 2 year Bible study. We enter into the book of Ruth this week, and Ruth is an important explanation of how salvation occurs, or at least one of the facets of how salvation occurs. In chapter 1, we have a family from Israel that has moved into Moab, and the husband and the sons all die in Moab after the sons have married. And Naomi, the mother, decides to return to Bethlehem and tells her daughter-in-laws, "I have nothing to give you. There's no sense in you coming with me. Go back, find husbands of your own, and prosper in Moab." And while the one daughter in law agrees to this, Ruth does not. In verse 16, Ruth replied, "Don't urge me to leave you or turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me." And you notice how Ruth's vow extended to her husband's family. Your people will become my people, and your God will become my God. And so we have this beautiful testimony of Ruth covenanting herself to Naomi. Well, in chapter 2, we see that Ruth meets Boaz, and in verse 8, Boaz says to Ruth, "My daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here at the women who work for me. Watch the field where the men are harvesting and follow along after the women. I've told the men not to lay a hand on you, and whenever you are thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars the men have filled." What Boaz is referring to here is that you'll remember when we went through the law that one of the elements that every farmer was to do is not to double glean their fields. In other words, they could go through once, but they could not go through a second time. And they needed to leave the edges of the field so that those who were impoverished could use the second or third or fourth gleanings as well as the edges of the field to feed themselves. And so Naomi has told Ruth to do this. Ruth has gone to Boaz's field, and Boaz notices her, the little twinkle in his eye, seems to like her a little bit, and then tells her that she, instead of having to follow after the first gleaning, can join the women who are doing the first gleaning, and also be able to be protected as well as get water and everything, which is not a small thing. They don't have a lot of water jars or water fountains or faucets. And so to have to bring your own water to work an entire day in a field is not a small thing that Boaz is offering here. Well, in Ruth chapter 3, we see that Boaz has gotten to the end of his harvest season. He's at the threshing floor and they are celebrating the harvest. And um, and so in verse 7, when Boaz had finished eating and drinking, was in good spirits, he went over to lie down at the far end of the grain pile. Ruth approached quietly, uncovered his feet, and lay down. In the middle of the night, something startled the man. He turned. There's a woman lying at his feet. Some scholars focus on the sleeping at the feet as though it is sexualized, and that really is, quite honestly, importing contemporary Western views into the interpretation. Scripture really has no problem pointing out when there is sexual sin, and there is no indication of sexual sin here in the original language or even in the English when it's translated. So none is specifically mentioned here. It's really better to think of this as Boaz protecting her honor, and physically, um, she shouldn't walk home at night. That's not, and certainly not walk home alone at night. That doesn't protect her. So he's telling her to stay with him for the night, go in the early morning when it's much safer, and there's early morning daylight. And I think everything in this chapter focuses on chastity between Boaz and Ruth. Chastity may not be a virtue in our day, but it does not mean that it never has been. And in Ruth and Boaz's day, chastity and honor were incredibly important. And so while we tend to look at it from Western eyes and sexualize this entire chapter, In reality, I don't think there's anything of that there. Boaz is treating her in a very gentlemanly way, in a very honorable way, and in a very protective way, both for her reputation as well as for her physically in chapter 3. In chapter 4, we see that Boaz wants to marry Ruth, and so he wants to become her kinsman redeemer. And a kinsman redeemer maintained the memory, the offspring, and the land of the deceased, and required um, that they be kin, that they were willing, that they were able, and that they could fully pay the price. Now, for somebody to be a kinsman redeemer, they got the land, which land was one of the more valuable assets of the day. And so the land was something that most people wanted. However, along with the land comes the widow. And the purpose of the kinsman redeemer was to have children with the widow, and her children would actually be able to inherit the land of their deceased father. And so, as a kinsman redeemer, you only had the land for a short period of time. You put all your work and effort and time and money into it, and you get nothing out of it. And in addition to that, the widowed wife and potentially the children from that arrangement are need to be fed, need to be cared for, and so your finances are going into that. So it is a fairly significant financial um, burden in order to become a kinsman redeemer. Well, Boaz has, as far as we can tell, Boaz has never been married, and so he's not worried about his other wife or children not receiving part of the inheritance. He owns land already, and so gaining Naomi's or Ruth's land as attached with her is something that certainly doesn't hurt him financially. But I think at the end of the day, he's just in love with her. And so he goes to Perez, or he goes to the leaders of the city, and there is a closer um, kinsman redeemer. And initially, the kinsman redeemer is like, "Yeah, I'll take the land." And then Boaz is like, "Oh, but remember, the wife comes along with it." And he's like, "No, I don't want any of that." And so Boaz becomes a kinsman redeemer. And this very much it foreshadows Jesus' role. Jesus needs to be both fully God, but also fully human. He needs to be kin with us. He needs to be willing, he needs to be able, and he needs to fully pay the price in order to be our kinsman redeemer. And that is exactly what Christ has done for us. It's interesting. At the end of Ruth, we have a short genealogy, and the genealogy, interestingly, begins with Perez. And Perez, you'll remember, is the offspring of um, uh, uh, Judah and Tamar. And Judah became, not rightly, but Judah becomes the kinsman redeemer for Tamar and has the offspring of Perez. And so Perez himself is what's called a Levirate marriage or a kinsman redeemer marriage. And then also, what should be pointed out here, especially since it's in a genealogy, is that in Deuteronomy 23, verse 3, we are told that no Moabite may be part of the people of Israel up to 10 generations. And yet, when we take a look at the genealogy here in verses 21 and 22 of Ruth chapter 4, we have Boaz, the father of Obed, Obed, the father of Jesse, Jesse, the father of David. Within 4 generations, a Moabite offspring is David, the king, who's going to be one of the Old Testament primary foreshadowings of Jesus Christ. And this is just shows God's graciousness in spite of the law. We oftentimes think that the Old Testament doesn't talk about God's graciousness at all. No, he talks about his holiness and righteousness and justice. And I don't think that that's the case at all. When we take a look at how God is working with his people, we see an incredible amount of graciousness going on. And we see that here with the offspring of Boaz and Ruth eventually being David, which leads us into the book of First Samuel. First Samuel starts out with Elkanah and Hannah Elkanah has another wife, and they have multiple offspring, but Hannah does not have any offspring, even though Hannah is kind of Elkanah's favorite wife. And so Hannah is at the tabernacle praying and tells God, if you will give me a son, I will dedicate that son to you. In other words, give him to tabernacle use. Um, and difficult as it was, Hannah is faithful to her prayer and vow. So she raises a child until he is weaned, which in that day would probably be anywhere from 2 to 5 years, probably somewhere in the 3 to 4 year range. So she's with him for quite a bit of time, and yet still gives him to God as she had vowed. And because of this faithfulness in her heart, God blesses her with other children as well. In 1 Samuel chapter 2, we see Hannah's prayer, which very much is parallel and reflective of Mary's prayer in the Gospel of Luke. And really asks the question, who can intercede if we sin against God? But also notes that if we honor God, he will honor us. And this is really an offset, a comparison with Eli's wicked sons who are sinning against God, are not honoring God. And rather than being able to serve God like Samuel is going to be, there's a prophecy against the house of Eli. And this really sets up these comparisons that are going to happen throughout the books of Samuel. And we want to be taking a look at those comparisons as we go along because they're going to help us to understand perhaps some new insights into these stories. Well, in 1 Samuel chapter 3, the Lord calls Samuel, and at first, Samuel keeps thinking it's Eli. He goes to Eli. Eli keeps telling him to go and lay down, and back and forth this goes. It seems as though Samuel is actually sleeping in probably in the holy place, if not right outside of it. Although I suspect that it's probably within the holy place. Not supposed to be there, but again, God is being gracious in the midst of this because of of the faithfulness they know Samuel is going to have. And so God eventually Samuel says, "Speak, Lord, your servant is listening." And the Lord talks about again a prophecy against Eli and his family. And Samuel really learns the first and most important lesson of a prophet: tell even the difficult prophecies. Because when Samuel first gets up in verse 15, he gets up in the morning, he opens all the doors of the house of the Lord. He's afraid to tell Eli the vision. You almost get this sense that Samuel, who's probably a child here, perhaps early teens, but probably a child to early teens. And so you get the sense he's just trying to avoid Eli, but Eli kind of brings him over, says, "Tell me what God said." And Samuel does. Samuel tells even the difficult prophecy to Eli. And that's important because that's something that we're going to see repeated over and over in the life of Samuel. Well, in Samuel chapter 4, we see the Philistines gathering to fight the Israelites. People sent people over to Shiloh to get the Ark of the Covenant. Now they haven't actually asked God what they should do. They've just done all this, and so this is Israel's first mistake here. But the Israelites in verse 5 raised such a great shout that the ground shook, and the Philistines heard it, and they realized that the Ark of the Covenant had come into Israelites' camp, and the presence of God frightens the ungodly. But if God is not fighting, simply bringing his presence does not ensure victory. God is not a talisman. He's not a good luck charm that you can bring in and force victory. And so although the presence of God frightens the Philistines, God is not fighting for the Israelites. So we find that the Israelites end up losing the battle. And when in verse 18, when Eli heard this, Eli fell backward off of his chair by the side of the gate. His neck was broken and he died. Was worried for the Ark of the Covenant, but interestingly, he doesn't ask about his sons. I think he already knows what's going to happen to his sons because of the prophecies that have already been told to him. What is significant about First Samuel chapter 4, and we should not miss this, is that this is the first time that God's glory has left Israel since the Exodus. So for a couple hundred years, God's presence, His glory has been with Israel, and now with the Ark of the Covenant going to the Philistines, His glory has left Israel for the first time. So this is a very significant event in Israel's history. Well, the ark is placed in the temple of Dagon. Dagon is one of the Philistines' primary gods, and it's kind of an offering to Dagon, right? And so Dagon, you helped us to be victorious over the Israelites, so we're going to bring you their God and set him before you. But of course, in the morning they find Dagon face down in front of the Ark of the Covenant. And then the next day, after they set him up again, his head and his hands are broken off. And this is actually what would normally be done to ancient kings. And so it really is a statement of God that he is king over Dagon. Well, they move um, the ark from one place to another because there's all sorts of afflictions going on, and nobody wants the Ark of the Covenant. In fact, the people of Ekron in verse 10 say they've brought the Ark of the God of Israel around to us to kill us and our people. Like they're so frightened of having God in His presence, which just goes to show in First Samuel chapter 5 that God does not need an army to defeat His enemies. So the Israelites are always concerned: how many people do we have? Are we strong enough? Can we fight these other nations? And chapter 5 of First Samuel shows God doesn't need an army; He can take care of Himself just perfectly fine without us. If anything, we fight in partnership with what God is doing in this world, rather than kind of bringing Him in to fight our battles. Well, the ark returns to the Israelites in chapter 6. And what's interesting in verse 3 is the Philistines say, if you return the ark of the God of the Israel, do not send it back to him without a gift. So they think they are sending the ark back to him as though somehow he is separated from the ark of the covenant. But of course, because we've read through the the Pentateuch, the books of the law, we realize that God's unique focused presence is in the Ark of the Covenant. He's not contained there, and certainly he still remains everywhere. And yet, there's a unique focus of God's presence on the Ark. And so they think they're kind of sending the Ark back to God when he has actually been in their presence. And so they're kind of missing some of the revelation of God going on there. And what's interesting also in verse 6, it says, why do you harden your hearts as the Egyptians and Pharaoh did? When Israel's God dealt harshly with them, did they not send the Israelites out so that they could go on their way? Again, all these years later, the story of the Exodus is still being circulated among the pagan nations. They are deeply impressed with what God has done. They're not impressed enough to follow him, and they still want to destroy the Israelites. But there is this hesitancy, there's this caution with how do we deal with these Israelites, because they have a God who's done something that we've never heard of before or after. Verse 9, they send the Ark of the Covenant on its way, along with golden symbols of the afflictions that they've had. These are offerings in some sense. And what's interesting in verse 9 is that they don't know the outcome. The priests and the diviners, who are supposed to be, these people who have, special ability to know what the gods want, they're not really sure what's going on either. They're not sure whether the cart is going to go back to Israel or it's going to come back to them. And so it just shows them to be false in terms of their abilities to give guidance in spiritual matters. Well, the ark does make its way back, and eventually the men of Kiriath Jearim come, and it stays in Kiriath Jearim for about 20 years. In chapter 7, we see that Samuel subdues the Philistines in Mizpah, And so in verse 4 it says the Israelites put away their Baals and Ashtaroths and served the Lord only. Now I find it interesting. It doesn't say that they destroyed their Baals and Ashtaroths or burned their Baals and Ashtaroths. It says they put them away. And I wonder if perhaps this is just a kind of setting aside for a time until they still, as we will see rather quickly, they are going to return back to Baal and Ashtaroth. And in verse 6, we also have when they had assembled at Mizpah, they drew water and poured it out before the Lord. This is probably a drink offering, similar to the drink offerings that we have talked about when we are looking at the Mosaic Law. When we get to chapter 8, Israel asked to have a king. And they don't want a king because they need somebody who's going to guide them in their spiritual walk with the Lord. They don't need a king because they need somebody who's going to represent the character that they should have. They want a king to be like the other nations, even to the point of rejecting God. And so God says to Samuel, they're not rejecting you, Samuel, they're rejecting me. And so while the first section, the first 7 chapters, highlight the differences between Eli and Samuel, as we begin to move into the kings, we're going to see in the following chapters the differences between Saul and David. And we'll be introduced to Saul as we get into our next summary for week chapter 31.